Welcome to the impacts of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, and the impact that's had on the hospitality industry. I think it's one of the biggest industries that have been hit, and I can just imagine how challenging it absolutely is for everyone. So I'm very pleased to be able to facilitate this and get you some quality information with really fantastic panelists today. So we've got Charles Lentini, who is our principal consultant at Mappian, and most of you will know Charles personally. And he's going to be talking about redundancies and just helping you navigate the legal parameters on conditions that we find ourselves in. We've also got Dr. Ian Haslam. He is one of our organisational psychologists that we have here. And because the toll is financially, personally, is just unprecedented globally. And it's just such a challenging time for everyone. And we've got Marie Elliott. Now, Marie, I apologise, your title and your area?
Oh, sorry, principal. Oh, am I the principal consultant for migration at Mappian?
It's a good thing we know our job titles. So thank you, Marie. So can I just we're actually going to go straight into, because getting information to you as quickly as we can is really critical. So if I can hand over to you, Dr. Haslam, and do a little intro and off you go.
Sure thing. So I'll just share my screen first, just to get the technology done and dusted. And there we are. Oh, it's very slow. So I suppose the way to introduce myself will be to, geez, that picture's quite old. I really should update that one. So as Lisa said, organisational psychologist with a Doctor of Psychology and a senior consultant here within Mappian. And my focus traditionally has been on psychometric measurements, so measuring constructs within our minds, and this extends to recently measures around stress and resilience as well. And particularly important in today's impacts. But I also have a passion for coaching. So performance coaching, executive coaching, in particular through self-insight and understanding the way that stress is impacting us and how that can extend to well-being and resilience as well. So this is one where, in particular, we're really looking at some unprecedented times in terms of the amount of stress that we do have on ourselves. So during these times, we do find that we are finding ourselves making some really difficult decisions and making some tough choices as well. It's been an exceptionally difficult time, in particular for the hospitality industry. There's been a great deal of material out there, and we've pushed that out there as well on how to look after your team, how best to support them through such a challenge. But the very same concepts are also perfect for turning inwards and ensuring that we're managing and looking after ourselves through this time as well. And the reason behind that, it's very similar to when you're flying, when you can fly again, and the instruction to look after your own oxygen before you look after the person next to you. The idea is if you can't look after those next to you if you can't help yourself first. So the better we look after those that we care about, whether they are your team, your business, or your family, the better you'll be able to look after everybody around you. And it starts internally. It starts with yourself. And it's about, at the end of the day, it's about resilience. It requires us to persevere and show some grit and demonstrate that resilience to give ourselves the best chance of managing ourselves effectively. And the rubber band analogy is a really good one to use in this case. It stretches, it adapts, it's flexible because it's got almost that liquid consistency, it bounces back. But if it dries out, if it isn't looked after, if it perishes, it loses its ability to stretch or flex, and it'll break. And so if we don't constantly grow and change and engage in that growth, the same thing will happen to us. It is about that consistency. And similar to grit, it's about being knocked down, but showing a focus and determination towards a particular outcome and getting back up and and moving ever forward. Now, it is about having that ability to cope and change with new situations. And I'd almost bring into the concept of fragility, as in breaking. So psychologically, physically, these sorts of things can make you just so tired you want to sleep all the time. Resilience is that bouncing back, and almost to the point where if you're optimistic and persevere and model that positivity, you can engage in that anti-fragility, or bouncing forward and making the most out of a situation, because this is the reality. So we're going to step through a framework initially for maintaining our resilience through growth. And the reason for that is quite apparent, when you really sit down to think about it. We're being bombarded at the moment. We're being forced to make some tough decisions, but we're being bombarded with information constantly. So much threatening information. And I'll step through a couple of concepts now on why this is having such an impact on us. But the body actually sends through the brain, through its various senses, and there's some research around this in the neurology, 11 million bits of information per second. Our brains are very good at chunking those bits together, and based on what it's learned, it kind of, it focuses specifically on what it thinks is important. Currently, our brains are worried and directing focus to things that may impact it and its family. And this is unfortunate for us as well, but evolutionarily, our brains also have a negativity bias, which drives a lot of that attention. So the negativity bias, basically when all things are considered equal, is the notion that things of a more negative nature, so unpleasant thoughts, emotions, social interactions, things that could be harmful, they take a greater emphasis on your consideration and focus, and where your psychological state is as well. And again, it's evolutionarily, it protected us. It enabled us to survive, to get where we are today. And it's trying to do the same at the moment. So anxiety and fear and those negative emotions change and influence the way that you're thinking. It actually narrows your thinking, the way that you communicate normally, and the way that you problem solve as well, the things that you consider. So narrowing your perceptions and giving you tunnel vision, it's understandable the influences that such information around is having on you at the moment. And it can get to the point where you have that almost that fatigue, that crisis fatigue. You receive a new piece of information, and it's having a decreased impact emotionally on what's happening, but also decreasing your energy levels as well. And it's interesting that out of the what they call the 7 universally experienced emotions that human beings have, right across the world, so that's joy, surprise, anger, contempt, sadness, fear, and disgust. Only one of them is purely positive, so that kind of contributes to that negativity bias. But what it does, though, is it makes leading with optimism and gratitude and modeling those positive and resilient behaviors and constructive behaviors extraordinarily difficult, because we're, with the people we're taking care of, or the people we are responsible for, are they're feeling this way, but so are we as well, and we need to manage that within ourselves so that we can manage others around us. To get through that, and to step through a model quite with some swiftness, I suppose, today, I wanted to take you through the fact that resilience and the behaviors that sit behind it are not something that are innate. They're learned behaviors. They're skills that you can learn and practice and continue to grow within yourself. And the model that we like to use at Mappian is what we call the growth model. And to step through it very quickly, the growth stands for goals. So having meaningful purpose in your life. The relationship side of things, so ensuring that your trusted connections are maintained. Optimism, so thinking under control, thinking positively. Remembering who I am, so that insight and self-reflection, whether it is who you are as a person or thinking about your team more broadly and thinking who are we, so that genuine understanding and reflection of your own identity. The tough moments, and this is one that we might experience several times a day, but managing them, managing our own emotions in those moments, and learning from the tough moments as well. And finally, making healthy choices, which can be challenging under self-isolation conditions, but one that can still be addressed and attempted as well. So we're going to step through each of these areas again, and I'll go through a few different ideas and concepts and some things that you might be able to take away and remember tomorrow as well. But as I've mentioned, growth, human beings need goals. We need something to engage us. Outcomes and things and goals that we strive for are what keep us engaged and keep us focused. It's critical to take focus and drive your own activity forward, or you'll end up ruminating. And these are, I guess, things that can be constructive. So sitting and thinking and doing nothing has a huge impact on your sense of purpose, and certainly your sense of identity, and ultimately, at the end of the day, your well-being as well. So we do need a purpose while we are finding ourselves in such trying situations. And this is a model that I'm sure everybody has seen before, and it feels quite simplistic, but it's always worth remembering. You know, SMART goals, having a SMART goal, or being mindful of the purposeful goal that we set in mind in flow for ourselves. So the SMART acronym is specific, so ensure that your goal is detailed and meaningful enough and specific. Is it measurable? So rather than being kind of in the ether and an abstract concept, can you measure it, and can you spot and describe what success looks like? Is it attainable? So is it realistic? Are you being kind to yourself and prescribing a goal that you can achieve under such circumstances? Is it relevant? So is it relevant to the work that is happening at the moment? Is it relevant to ensuring that you do maintain your own positivity and your own well-being? And is it time-based? So rather than stretching out your goal, is it something that you can set a definite deadline for? So having goals are important, but we've mentioned before that human beings are inherently social. We crave connection, and that doesn't even matter if you're the most introverted of us. You still require that connection. We developed this way. This is how we are, and we rely upon each other for survival. So that connectivity, along with our amazing and impressive brains, is how we as a species have been so successful for so long. By working together, and this is what we must focus on, particularly at this point where we may be physically apart from each other. We need to belong very, very much. So how do we facilitate this under a crisis or remotely? The idea is frequent connectivity, frequently checking in, reaching out to your friends, family, or professional network. And to be honest, in a situation like this, sometimes it can feel forced. But it is important, and the reason for that is some research out there that does mention, and I'm not sure if this is well known outside of the psychological circles, but when you feel left out, when you feel isolated, your brain recognizes that as physical pain, and it responds accordingly. Whether it's psychological isolation or a reduced number of colleagues around you, we're all experiencing it, and the brain is interpreting it as a real physical pain. And that has long-term implications for your health as well. So those connections are critical. And so I'd ask you to consider thinking about your networks, thinking about who is your professional support network? How do they support you? How do you support them? Because that's part of the process as well. On a scale of 1 to 10, how effectively are you maintaining those relationships at present? Could you ensure that you could reach out and speak frankly or speak authentically with these connections, whether it be professional, whether it be your family, whether it be very good friends? And can you rely on them for support if you really need it? And can you speak frankly in such a way? The next is optimism, and this is very difficult to achieve under these circumstances. Even the most positive and optimistic of us are being impacted by this with our energy levels and with our moods and general attitude as well. I've certainly seen it amongst my own team and amongst my family and friends. Those who are most positive and generally the most energetic and enthusiastic I've seen dips. People are going through peaks and troughs, myself included. I was just saying to Lisa and saying to our team earlier this week, I'm exhausted. I've had a restful weekend and my energy levels are dipped. And it was that connection and speaking optimistically with the team that brought me back. I was able to facilitate some work, and it was that connection was key, as was the optimism from the team. So with that negativity bias, our brains are directing attention to such information, but having to derail that and recognize when that happens is a skill, but it is key, but it is hard. Further to this, our brains are constructed in such a way that every thought and ultimately behavior is first driven and colored by our emotions. We are inherently emotional creatures. We are social and we are emotional, regardless of how objective we feel like we are. Everything is driven through that. And these are particularly heightened and negative in such circumstances. And the leader's job, our job, is to maintain that positivity with ourselves and others as well. Positively framing the situation, seeing every problem as a challenge and an opportunity. These are challenging. It is all very challenging, especially when you're experiencing your own stresses. In fact, more so in some cases, particularly with those leadership responsibilities and everything that comes with that. So practicing those positive thoughts, thinking about retraining your brain, thinking about reframing wherever possible, can strengthen those neural pathways, and you become better at it. You actually become better at thinking positively and reframing. It's one of those amazing things that our brain does quite well. And it is behind those optimistic or pessimistic thoughts that that such pathways are strengthened. So we would ask ourselves, when does being pessimistic demonstrate some usefulness? When the cost of failure is large? Yeah, absolutely. An example might be a neurosurgeon preparing for an operation, thinking about every possible outcome. You want them to be thinking, what can go wrong here? But when is optimism useful? Well, when it's realistic. So being unequivocally positive and just blindly thinking that everything's going to go well, it's not so useful. But where it is compared to pessimism, being realistic about being positive, generally speaking, the long-term benefits are that you will be able to solve problems more effectively and deal with threats in the moment. You're less likely to suffer from mental health issues, do better with your work, and you'll generally be more productive. And the evidence suggests that over the last couple of years as well. It allows us to generate states of resourcefulness and to think more broadly rather than with that narrow focus, and consider more options in terms of problem solving. And it motivates us to search for and demonstrate that improvement of our situation as well. The who am I is key. And this isn't just about knowing yourself, but it's also about knowing how you're feeling in the moment as well, and recognizing those feelings, those trepidatious feelings. Relationships are key, but equally as important is understanding authentically who you are, what is important to you, what do you value, what our strengths are. So who am I? What characterizes me? What do I do well? What do I need help with? Who can I reach out to for help with those particular areas? And with that understanding, we know where we slot in and where we can provide the most value to the people who rely on us the most. So that's self-awareness, as I've said, understanding what you do well, but more broadly, checking in with your own self, your own well-being. At the moment, and I've spoken with clients about this quite a lot in the last 2 weeks, we're thinking very tactically, we're thinking very goal-focused, we're running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and that is wearing us down. It's actually wasting away our energy levels, our levels of motivation, to the point where we just want to sleep more. I think it's certainly what I've found. But recognizing that feeling, recognizing levels of anxiety or levels of stress. How's my heart rate going? Those little indications. Where are my automatic thoughts taking me? Recognizing those and seeing when they pop up for us, actually it allows us to take control and to take over those feelings and to redirect them in a more positive way. But it all starts with that knowledge of self, knowledge of values, and knowledge of how things are impacting us as well. And as I've said, the self-monitoring. So how are you feeling? Where are your thoughts directing you? How are you reacting to certain situations? And is that different to what they normally are? Is that a good or a bad thing? And seeking that feedback wherever you can as well on how you are acting and how you are impacting on those around you. The tough moments are key. And there are many of these around at the moment, and we can absolutely learn from every single one of them. We're going to make mistakes. It happens. We're human beings and we are fallible. What matters is catching that moment, accepting the fact that we are human, but that we can also learn. And that's one of the wonderful things about us. How do we collectively learn from the mistakes that we make and try to navigate these new waters and improve? We do need to be authentic in these cases. So great lessons can be learned from, for example, the way the aviation industry views errors. Versus, ironically enough, the medical field. With aviation, they unpack and explore every single issue and every error, every mistake that's made, and treat it as a learning, outcome, so that they can grow and they can improve. And this is something that we can all take away. Really exploring how we have reacted and growing for next time. And in those tough moments, we can absolutely feel a really substantial level of pressure. And to a certain point, feeling that pressure can be beneficial. When you have those really low levels of stress, there's no pressure, and it's unlikely to kind of motivate you and push you forward. But we're really geared to feel a little bit of that stress, and that enables us to press forward. When we get up to the top of that peak there, where we're feeling that stretch, that is bringing us up to that peak performance. We're really feeling the burn there, but our bodies aren't designed to sit in that moment for too long. So over time, that stress can really weigh down on you. And we know from the research that ongoing levels of stress really have a huge impact on things like, as I've said, our problem solving, our energy, our motivation, to the point where we may experience burnout. And this is an area where we simply don't want to go. And that's where that stress comes in with the curve. So how do we recognize when we are in that constant state of amber alert or red alert? And it's about understanding our own bodies, our own reactions, and our own minds. And recognizing when we're in a red mode and in that red area, how do we get out of that? And so there are some ways. We like to use the stop, breathe, leave scenario. So when you feel that happening, saying to yourself, even if it's in your head, stop very loudly, can be a circuit breaker, and it can allow you to stop and remind you that you can choose to respond differently rather than letting that emotion carry you away. You can stop and take a few breaths, breathing in quite deeply. We recognize that when we're in that state, our breathing is more shallow. So breathing in more deeply from the diaphragm, it can have a crazy impact on the way that you're feeling. And if that doesn't work, if you can't keep yourself focused and calm, there's always the leave. So removing yourself from the situation and ensuring that you do take those steps away and only return when you are feeling a bit better. So stop, breathe, leave. And healthy choices are the final. So not just for physical health, but psychologically healthy choices as well. Ensuring that sustainability of our work. And at the moment in this current situation, we need to be working quite a lot. Paying attention to family and those hygiene factors is really key. And by hygiene, I mean things that ensure that your brain remains healthy. So practicing mindfulness, if that's your thing, lifting heavy things and putting them back down again, and then lifting them up and putting them back down again, if that's your thing as well. If you had to get in front of the TV, put the PlayStation on. If there's a book that's been on your mind, read it. Be prepared for a marathon, because these scenarios are going to continue, and ensuring sustainability of that is absolutely key. And look, the research says at a minimum, all of these things, 2 serves of fruit and 5 serves of veg every day, 2 to 3 serves of lean meat, fish, whole grains, 30 minutes of exercise, 8 hours of sleep, 8 glasses of water. This can be very challenging at the moment, particularly in the States and in the isolated states that we're in. I know for one, I can't get 8 hours of quality sleep a day. That's just not happening. I try to exercise more, but these things are more or less within our grasp, depending on what our current scenario is, but doing what you can. And with the support of others around you, you can still engage in these healthy living practices and ensure that you are practicing through growth as well as you possibly can. And these points all do sit within the coaching that we provide for resilience, and the coaching for careers as well, and also our resilience training also. So as I've mentioned, these factors, while they fit very well in our current scenario, they're useful in all aspects of life, but particularly pertinent for now as well. And with that as my time up, I might unshare my screen now and hand back. Thank you very much for listening.
Mute. There we go. Have to unmute. Thank you very much. And I appreciate that the tips that you're giving, and some of them we do know absolutely. For example, 8 hours of sleep. I don't know anyone who's getting 8 hours of quality sleep at the moment. These are the challenging times. And I think I did forget to introduce myself at the beginning. I apologise. I jumped in because the impressive people here in front of you. My name is Lisa Payton, and I am a registered psychologist, and I specialise in organisational psychology. So Ian and I actually work in the same team. And I'm very impressed with the people, that people have made the time to come and join this webinar, because you're gearing yourself up to know the knowledge, the technical, what can I do? How do I navigate in this environment? And what I find when I'm doing leadership, I'm supporting leaders, is having the knowledge, and we get that, but it's actually having the conversations are incredibly challenging, and having to deal with emotions, not only your own, but others. So these are tough times. So yeah, so we are absolutely feeling for each and every one of you, and want to be there to support. So with that, Charles, if I can hand over to Charles, please, and to talk us and help us navigate this interesting time.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. What I'll do is I'll likewise share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay, that's working on my end. Can you see it, everyone? Okay. First of all, yes, my name's Charles Lentini. Many of you might know me from the hospitality industry. I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for attending and being party to this particular presentation. It does mean a lot to me. I've been at Livingston's, now changed to Mapian, for nearly 3 years now, and I've surrounded myself with a wonderful team. So we've got Lisa, Ian and Marie. Lisa, Ian obviously in the organisational development team, and they just do a wonderful job in relation to the actual psychology at work. And I think that they can really provide some benefits to the hospitality industry, particularly one of many, but in terms of psychometric assessments and so forth, whereby they can actually ascertain whether someone is a good fit or not for the workplace. But there's a whole range of things as well. And as well as the immigration team, Marie Elliott, who's a principal in that area and a practice leader. And she provides some very good advice every day to many industries, including the hospitality industry. So if you're considering using migration services, I'd highly recommend that you use Marie and her team. Okay, so what I'm about to talk about is redundancy pay obligations. And I do note from the outset that in the hospitality industry award, there has been an amendment and insertion of a Schedule L. So everyone should be aware of that, which is a temporary provision starting from the 24th of March. And you'll note in that particular schedule, there's the ability for the employer to reduce hours for full-time and part-time employees. Okay, so that may very well be an option for you as opposed to redundancy. And obviously there's the option of stand down if there's no work that's available due to a closure. So leaving that aside, the question arises, well, okay, if I have to make a person's position redundant, do I have to pay redundancy pay? So what I've done is, and I'm hoping that this I'm going to give it another go. Oh, here we go. Right, there was just a delay, I'm sorry. The internet must be slow. So what I'll be doing is, that's the page I wanted, is looking at this particular section, which is the section under the Fair Work Act that deals with the obligation to pay redundancy pay. Now, this particular provision still applies to many awards. Some awards may have different provisions, but most of them don't. They refer to this particular clause. But certainly in the hospitality industry award, this is the one to follow. So as you can see, the entitlement to redundancy pay depends on a couple of elements. Now, first of all, a person's entitled to redundancy pay if their employment is terminated. And so what we're going to do is look at some cases about what that means. And secondly, the employment is terminated at the initiative of the employer because the employer no longer required the job to be done by anyone. Okay, and not due to the ordinary customary turnover of labour. So that's not the issue here. But certainly the two elements to look at are, has there been a termination of the employment, and was the job no longer required because of the employer? Now, the ability or the obligation to pay redundancy pay depends on obviously a person's length of service. So under the NES, if you've got less than 1 year, you don't get any severance pay. If you're a small business employer, meaning an employer with less than 15 employees, then you don't get the severance pay, this sort of thing. So leaving that aside, most of those organisations out there that are quite large will have that obligation to pay redundancy pay somewhere along the line. Now, from that particular provision, and also the case law that we're going to look at, there's a distinction between the employment being terminated and the job being made redundant. Okay, they're two particular concepts and they're different, and they need to both be ticked in order to have the entitlement to redundancy pay. So what we'll be doing is looking at some cases, and one case is the Adcock and Blackmore's case, and it's a Federal Circuit Court decision, so it's quite persuasive in our area. It involved a gentleman who was a commercial manager, and he had a contract of employment and an enterprise agreement that applied. And July 2014, his position was made redundant, but they were able to offer him alternative positions. And it's noted that in his contract, there was a condition that he may be required to perform other tasks or duties within his training and skill set, and that his position and responsibilities may vary during the course of the employment. So there was at least that particular clause in there, but certainly for what we're going to talk about, it's about whether the employment has ended. So this particular employer was offering all these alternative jobs so they could retain his services. But by September 2014, Mr. Adcock refused the alternative roles, and then he made a claim for redundancy pay and other termination entitlements. And this had to be determined by the court. So the court had to determine whether there was a termination of the employment, and if there was, whether it occurred by way of redundancy. And by way of extract, you can see in the middle bubble line there that termination employment means termination of the employment relationship and then end of the provision of work in exchange for payment. So it's that broader term of what employment is. It's not actually left to whether you've got one employment contract and another employment contract. It's the employment relationship. Is the employment relationship being terminated? And the court found that for Blackmore, they never terminated his employment. And on the contrary, they did everything they could to retain his services by offering him alternative positions. So the court decided that there wasn't a termination of the employment, and therefore no redundancy pay in that regard. So yeah, that was a very interesting case that applied to the scenario or section 119 here. Another case which comes from the Fair Work Commission. It's quite a famous case. It's got a long name, but Navitas is what we do call it. And this involved a training organisation like a school where Mr. Kiam was employed on a series of maximum term contracts. So what happens there is that over a number of years, they just extend contracts. So you have one contract, for example, for a year, and they give you another contract, another contract, another contract, another contract. So what happened after a number of years, the employer said, well, we don't like you anymore because we don't think your performance is up to speed. We're just not going to offer you another contract. So therefore, your contract ends at the end of the last date, which I think was a year or so. And that was it. And so Mr. Kalmer, he didn't like this very much, so he claimed unfair dismissal. And obviously a similar concept comes up here with respect to, did the employer terminate the employment? Was it at the initiative of the employer? So that was the question here, similar to our redundancy question, whether the employee's employment had been terminated at the initiative of the employer. And the Fair Work Commission, which is full bench in this case, looked at this, and Mr. Kalmer said, well, look, I was dismissed. It was plain to see. Just because my contract finished at the end of the period doesn't mean that they didn't dismiss me. And the full bench agreed with that. They said, well, look, it was the employer that brought the employment to an end by not extending the contracts, because the employer was arguing that, well, we didn't terminate the employment relationship. It just came to an end by mutual agreement as per the terms of the contract. But the full bench didn't buy that. They said, no, the employer's actually terminated the employment by not extending the contracts any further. So in this case, the full bench looked at the circumstances of the entire employment relationship, particularly the years of extended contracts that he had as well, rather than the final employment contract. And then they decided that he had been dismissed and the employment was terminated at the initiative of the employer. Okay, so what does this all mean? For us, particularly with respect to redundancy pay, well, the Fair Work Act, as per section 119, requires there to be a termination of the employment relationship, okay, before you get an entitlement to redundancy pay, okay? And the redundancy of a job or position does not necessarily amount to a termination of the employment, given if you were offering other jobs and so forth. I just like to state, you can see the note down there that this is general information, so it won't apply to transfer of business situations, okay? So we're really focusing on what's happening between the one employer, and if you've got an agreement or award or a contract that provides a greater entitlement, it may change things, okay? So I'm purely looking at the Fair Work Act, section 119, but I know that this would apply in the hospitality industry award as well. So what we're going to do now is, okay, here's the theory, there's the law. How does this actually apply in practice, okay? So we've got scenario one. So you've got a full-time position. You don't require it anymore due to the operational requirements of the business. You go to your full-time employee and say, look, I really can't keep this full-time position open because of the downturn or whatever it might be, but I can give you a part-time job or even a casual job. And the employee says, yeah, I agree. I agree to transfer to that. The answer based on the case law is, does the person get redundancy pay? No. Why? Because there hasn't been a termination of the actual employment. It's continued. Okay, so technically speaking, there's no redundancy pay entitlement there. The next practical application too is, okay, well, the full-time position no longer required due to the operational reasons, fair enough. You go to your full-time employee and say, look, I can't really keep this job open for these reasons. I'm prepared to offer you a part-time job or a casual job. But the employee can do this. They can refuse, say, no, I don't want to accept this part-time or casual job. I prefer to keep my full-time job. Okay, so the part-time job and the casual job is rejected. The employment is terminated at the initiative of the employer. So there would be an entitlement to redundancy pay in that situation. However, the employer has the ability under section 120 of the Fair Work Act to seek a variation. So that would entail applying to the Fair Work Commission to say, well, look, okay, I made the position redundant. Yes, I terminated the employment. Yes. but he was offered a part-time job. We don't really want to have to pay 10 weeks severance pay, for example. We only want to pay 3 weeks and then see if the Fair Work Commission approves that. If they don't, you still have to pay the full amount. So given those two scenarios, they should show fairly clearly where there has been a termination of the employment relationship and there has not. And obviously, if there has not been a termination of the employment relationship, there is no entitlement to redundancy pay. Now, just lastly, just some ways. Now, this might not be an option for you now, but maybe in the future when you're redoing your employment contracts or appointment letters, it would be a good idea to include a condition in those appointment letters to make the scope of the job broad. So you might have a provision there that requires employees to perform other duties that the employer may direct them to perform within their skills, training and experience. And I've looked at a lot of the hospitality appointment letters and they generally have these sorts of things in there. Two, you might want to be able to actually vary the position and responsibilities during the course of the employment, so a different position within the job. Or maybe, if necessary, have the ability to relocate them if required due to the operational needs of the business. So what you're trying to achieve here is to have a very wide scope of what the job is, because invariably, leaving aside the termination of employment issue, whether the job is made redundant depends on the scope of your job. So therefore, if you extend the scope of your job to include that and many other positions or responsibilities, then that reduces the exposure to having to pay redundancy pay because the job is so wide. So this is something that you might like to consider with your appointment letters or employment contracts. That's basically it. So I thank you very much for your time. I hope you can use the information in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And some really nice practical application there for people as well. So not having a legal background, I got a little lost in some of the terminology, but those practical examples were fantastic and really helped cement it. So for anyone who's listening, please do not hesitate to ask your questions. I am going to hand over to Marie Elliott. And Marie had 13 years with the Department of Immigration. And since leaving immigration was employed as a registered migration officer, agent, I beg your pardon, RMA, with accounting firms, law firms, and her own company, and now Mappian. She's also been a lecturer at the migration law at ANU for about 10 years and ACU, the Australian Catholic University, for about 12 months. And very lucky, has had experience and exposure in the hospitality industry with RMA for over 20 years. So if I can, and she has also, so she represented restaurants, hotels and catering companies throughout Australia. So Marie, if I can hand over to you now, please.
Hi, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Charles. Well, to commence, unfortunately for businesses who sponsor people from overseas in the hospitality industry specifically, they have an obligation to comply with sponsorship conditions. The problem with this is that whatever the contract is under which they have employed their staff, that is the basis under which they have to continue to employ them. That's an obligation under the Migration Act. What this means is that unlike some of the employers that Charles has just spoken about, where businesses employ people on a subclass 457 or a 482 visa, they are required to follow the Fair Work Act in terms of their redundancy packages or any other type of cessation of work. However, they also have an obligation, unlike Australian employers, where they have to actually comply with whatever the contract says. So where an Australian employer, like Charles has just mentioned, can offer shorter hours, they can offer different work, they can offer casual hours. Under the Migration Act, an employer who is a sponsored, approved sponsor or an approved employer they have to actually abide by the conditions of the contract and therefore cannot offer any other type of work. What this means to an employee at the moment who is on a 457 or 482 visa, virtually they've got no options. Which is very, very unfortunate. As far as I'm aware, the government is looking into trying to see what they can do for sponsored employees. The reality is that the only thing available to employers at the moment is to offer leave without pay if the employee and the organisation are in agreement to leave without pay for at least 3 months. It can be extended to 12 months, but it can be very difficult. And the leave without pay has to be very well documented, agreed on by both the company and the employee, and it has to be notified to immigration within 28 days because there's been a change in the circumstance of the employee. The problem with 457 and 482 visa holders is that their contract has to be full-time. That's what it says. Their salary has to be a specific salary, and that's the basis of their visa grant. So what happens is that where they now find themselves without an employer or with limited employment, that would be a breach of their visa conditions. And at the moment, the government has not made any allowances whatsoever or exemptions to the obligations of either the visa holder or the company. So in reality, if somebody ceases work, they have 60 days or 90 days, depending on when their visa was granted, to then find either another employer or leave Australia. They don't have access to any benefits. They don't have access to Medicare. They don't have access to Centrelink. They have absolutely no recourses whatsoever. Which is a very dismal outlook for employees. The problem with their contracts, with complying with their contracts, are that they can't go part-time, like I said earlier, because under the visa conditions, it's a full-time employment. They can't reduce their hours because it has to be full-time employment. They can't reduce their salaries because their contract specified a specific salary. So in reality, like I said, they've only got work without pay as the only means to be able to stay in Australia for a very short while, and then hopefully if things change and they get re-employed or whatever happens. If a company, for example, was able to offer them a different position, and I'm not quite sure how in the hospitality industry, if you're a restaurant manager, you're a restaurant manager, but say they could offer them something different, that would entail having to still advertise the position for 28 days. It would still entail them having to re-nominate the position, and then the visa applicant would have to reapply for that visa because the visa under which they currently are in Australia would not be valid for them to apply for the second nomination. So if it's a separate nomination, separate visa, totally new application, totally new process. The issue with that, of course, is that anyone that has a sponsored employee now would know that under the current legislation, if you nominate somebody on a 457 or 482 visa, well, not the 457 because they're no longer available, but people still have them. So under the 482 regime, anyone that applies has to pay what they call a SAF levy. So the SAF levy is a Skilling Australians Fund levy that was introduced a couple of years ago by the government. That requires that if a person is nominated for a position, the company, if they turn under $10 million a year, they have to pay $12,000 for each year. They turn over more than 10 million, it's $1,800 for every year of the sponsorship. So a company could end up having to pay $7,200 or $4,800 for a 4-year visa for someone if they renominate them because they've offered them something different. So whichever way you look at it, I don't think too many companies are going to be in a position to do that at this point. So in reality, all I can say is that you have to abide by the conditions of the visa. The sponsors have to abide by the sponsorship obligations. If they do cease employment for any reason, the sponsor has to notify immigration within 28 days, regardless of how that cessation occurs. And otherwise, the visa applicants, like I said, have 30 days or 60 days, 60 days or 90 days in which to either find another sponsor, apply for a different visa like visitor visa, because that's about the only thing they can apply for, and leave Australia. If they do cease employment with the current employer, regardless of why that happens, they do not have, they are not able to work for any other employer unless the new employer nominates them and they apply, and then they can transfer their visa to that new employer if it's under the same occupation. So that's the only way they can actually access work. So not only do they not have access to any benefits, they're not allowed to work for anybody else because that's a condition of their visa.
Incredibly tough times.
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's not a lot I can say about it because really they don't have any options.
Yeah. If I can just interject for a moment, we've got David has asked a question. He's saying, bonjour. Do we need to notify the department if they are on a LWOP?
On leave without pay, yes, they do.
They do?
Yes.
Okay.
It's in the best interest of the company to advise immigration of anything that in any change of circumstance.
Okay, lovely, thank you. It's hard to put a positive spin on any of that, and I guess the messages is we don't. It's having those tough conversations, and I think being in that must be really tough for people, having to deliver messages like that and also having to receive the message like that.
Well, it's very difficult for most of the migration agents because we are getting absolutely bombarded by, both the companies and, because, companies obviously care for their staff. It's no, there's no question. But I mean, if there's no work, there's no work. There's nothing they can do about it. So, but obviously it's heart-wrenching when, visa holders are ringing us saying, well, what do we do? Well, the only thing I can say is that the Migration Institute of Australia is lobbying very strongly lobbying the government very strongly to see what they can do for these people. They have to do some sort of either relaxing the obligations or just allowing them to access some sort of help. I just don't know, but I know that they are being lobbied.
Yeah, and what we see how quickly things can turn around in legislation at the moment. So I guess it's just watch that space, but incredibly tough for people. And I guess for me, it's about what's the people be looking for those practical applications. So it's to arm yourself if you're in this is, well, how can I support people? Who can I get, who can they get financial advice from? And the government offers lots of free services and things like that. So that really pragmatic thing is what people need now. So that's how you as an employer, you can actually support people to do that. And just get them in touch. And I had a conversation with someone the other day and he was talking to me about not being able to feed his family. And I went, I don't know, where do you get food from? I don't know if you don't have money, I'd never been exposed to that. So I went and found out, there's places that you can actually go and get support for that. So I guess it's just arm yourself a little bit as well. And that, please, just what Ian was saying before about taking care of yourself during this is absolutely critical. And we do need to be there for other people. And we also need to be there for ourselves. So it's an incredibly tough time. So I don't know, one piece of advice for people, Charles?
I think that utilise the flexibilities that you've got under the Hospitality Award. Schedule L, the ability to reduce hours, the ability to direct employees to take annual leave with 24 hours notice and so forth. Also under the Fair Work Act, there's the ability to stand down. Now you have to abide by the strict provisions of that, whereby there's no work due to a stoppage of work that the employer is no longer is not responsible for. But at the end, if you do have to make employees redundant, then I've given some advice in relation to whether or not redundancy pay will be paid. and also comply with the genuine redundancy requirements of the Fair Work Act as well. So just assess the crisis as it comes along. Don't jump the gun too soon and make people redundant. Look at all these other flexibility options first.
Great advice, thank you. And also there's a lot of research that's been done around redundancies and these types of things, and it finds that people actually when they're in that moment can come out stronger at the other side. It's how we do it, how we support people, what conversations we have, and to lead with compassion and empathy at the moment is critical. We still have to have our tough conversations. We're not diluting messages, we're telling people as it is. But it's to, lead with compassion and taking care of self. Ian, if you've got one final piece of advice for everyone, sorry.
Be kind to yourself. This is completely, I don't want to use the word unprecedented because I think I've heard that way too much in the last month to ever say it again. But first and foremost, be kind to yourself. It's almost a given that you're going to do absolutely everything that you can possibly for yourselves, for your business, for your teams. Things are going to happen where you don't perform as well as you feel like you should. And in those cases, it's because the stress and the pressure is almost crushing you. So make sure you do look after yourself, be kind to yourself, and ensure that resilience ongoing.
Lovely, thanks. It's great. Actually made me tear up for a second. It's just like, seriously, we actually do need to be kind to ourselves, and we're so busy being there for lots of other people at the moment. And that's great advice. Marie, one final thought?
Oh, just hang in there and hope that the government comes to the party and, recognises that all of these people on temporary visas are all taxpayers just like the rest of us, and, that at this time of such a terrible time that they need help just like everyone else.
Yeah,
so hang in there.
Thank you very much. And we still have 2 minutes left, so I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm very happy to hear your experiences if you're uncertain about anything. And you're welcome to ask any of us, whether it's in the psychology area or the legal side or immigration. We've got the question and answer box there, so we're all quite... It's hard to not, I find it really hard because I facilitate a lot, so not getting feedback from people is very hard for me. So I'm like, how you doing out there? You guys okay? Have we answered all your questions?
Oh.
I'm going to take no answer as yes, as an answer. All right, team, we might just end now if that's all right. Thank you all so much for being participants and just arming yourself with knowledge, and please do take good care of yourself during this time. And instead of unprecedented, Ian, I'm using it's a 1 in 100 year event is how it's being described. So it's, it's very unique.
Event is a good one. 1 in 100 year opportunity to do the right thing.
Exactly. Okay, well, I will end our meeting. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Oh, and will you be sharing presentations? Yes, we will, absolutely. We'll send them out for you. And Sharon has just said,
thank you, Sharon.
Thank you all, you're very welcome. I hope everyone got something out of it. And Malcolm, you're very welcome. Right, take good care of yourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.